Hello, welcome to History 311, D1 online, European History 1648 to 1848. This is our first week, so let me just give you a little bit of an introduction to the course. You'll see that the course is set up in modules. We'll have 7 modules, each corresponding to a chapter in your textbook. So look closely at those chapters, or at each chapter. We have about 2 weeks for each of these chapters, so we have plenty of time to get through quite a bit of material. This week we're looking at the Reformation. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. You also have, for every module, a quiz. I'm going to be publishing one of these video lectures every module to try and personalize it, to kind of make it like a more traditional class. So this is the time when I kind of talk at you, because it's not a conference discussion, but then you have a chance to respond in the discussion forums as well, where we can talk about some of the topics that I bring up in these video lectures. And I also hope to set up virtual office hours as well, where you can contact me if you click on conferencing. I'll post some announcements about that to give you direction when I try it out for the first time next week. I've never done it before myself, so it's a bit of experimentation. Then you have the weekly quizzes as well, which test your comprehension of the material we've been talking about. So do your reading, read the textbook, take notes on these lectures, and then take part in the discussions, and then we'll have a midterm and a final exam, and we have one writing assignment towards the end of the semester. So that is where we're at. But let's talk about the Reformation. This is one of these real moments of change in history, when the Catholic Church, which had been dominant over the majority of the Christian peoples of the world, most of whom, not all, lived in Europe, because there were, of course, Christians living in the Middle East and Africa, and even as far as Asia and India at this time. But the largest church was the Roman Catholic Church, which drew its roots back to ancient Rome. And I want to start actually by pointing out something that happened on the periphery of Europe, on the edge of Europe, that impacts the Reformation, that helps to cause the Reformation. And that is in 1453, I'm not a big date person, but this is a pretty important one, the city of Constantinople, the city-state. So it was a nation or a kingdom of its own, but it was a large city. It was known as Constantinople. It was the easternmost remnant of the old ancient Roman Empire, but it wasn't technically part of the Catholic Church. It was a Eastern Orthodox Christianity, but it falls in 1453 to the Ottoman Empire. It had been under siege in that part of the world for quite a while. In fact, I want to point out that at this point in history, in the 14 and 1500s, Christianity in Europe is kind of on the defensive, especially because of the growing power of the Ottoman Empire at this time, which has a very powerful land army. It's part of this collection of gunpowder kingdoms, nations that had weaponized gunpowder and used it in cannons, and then they would begin making muskets as well. So this happens in 1453. Many of those scholars, religious, ecclesiastical leaders flee Constantinople, and where do they go? Well, they're going to go to centers of Christianity. They go to places like Rome, where they'll bring their ancient learning with them. Thing to keep in mind about the Reformation is that it doesn't just happen in a vacuum. These guys bring their ancient knowledge about ancient Christianity with them, and the way that Christianity in centuries before had been practiced, and it kind of sparks a lot of interest. It helps to spark what's known as the Renaissance, the rebirth in Rome and in Europe. So that's one cause of the Reformation. Another cause of the Reformation is simply the printing press. This is an IT revolution, information technology revolution, the printing press. So when the spark that really lights the fire underneath the Reformation occurs in 1517, when Martin Luther ostensibly tacks his 95 Theses to the wall of the bishop's place there in that city in Germany known as Worms, spelled like worms, in 1517. His protest against the Catholic Church is going to be carried by way of pamphlets and what we call broadsheets, printed very cheaply by printers by Gutenberg's printing press. This is a very important moment in the history of information because it's hard to imagine the Reformation occurring as it did without that technology. So everywhere that the printing press is introduced, in fact, kings try to ban it, but they're unable to do so, in part because it's so easy to hide them, and people want printing presses. Business people want printing presses because it's a great way for a small business to make money. Okay, the other thing I want to talk about is the spectrum of beliefs which the Reformation spawns. A spectrum of beliefs. That means this kind of semicircle. You can put an arc in your notes. On the one far side, I describe it as Catholicism. I describe Catholicism or the Catholic Church. At the far most conservative side, this is the established church that had been around for centuries. In the 1500s, they have their 7 sacraments, for example. 7 things which good Christians have to do. We are not in a theology class, so we don't have to learn all 7 of those. But Protestants will generally only recognize 2 sacred sacraments. And keep in mind of the language here, Protestant literally refers to all Christians who are not Catholic. This word comes into being during the Protestant Reformation, those people who protested against the church. Soon princes and kings in nations all across Europe were deciding that they wanted to become something other than Catholic. A lot of them did this for not exactly the most religious of reasons, like Henry VIII, right? Henry VIII of England, and as we work our way across that spectrum of beliefs which I'm talking about, of Christian religious beliefs, Catholicism on the far side, close to Catholicism is the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, with Henry VIII as its head. Henry VIII, famous, of course, for his 7 wives, 2 of which lost their heads, right? Anne Boleyn famously would be beheaded. But Catherine of Aragon was Henry VIII's first wife, a devout Catholic she was. Henry wants a divorce. Only popes can, at that time, grant divorces. Only rich and powerful people ever were given divorces. But the Pope decides he's not going to grant Henry VIII a divorce. Henry VIII, seeing that this thing called the Reformation was in full swing, and that there were already kings and a few queens that were choosing to break away from the church, he says, you know what? I think I can have more power with having to share it with you. That's Henry VIII speaking to the Pope. And he breaks away from the church, proclaims himself the head of the new church, the Church of England, the Anglican Church. It doesn't change that much. The Church of England doesn't change all that much. The Church of England is close to Catholicism at that time because, they don't recognize all of those sacred sacraments, but the churches look the same. There are some in England who would like to see the church go farther in becoming more Protestant, right? And I'll talk about that in a second as we work through this spectrum of beliefs. In the middle of that spectrum of beliefs are those known as Lutherans. These are the followers of Martin Luther. And it's after the Peace of Augsburg that this was a kind of a peace treaty to try and end some of the violence that came with all of these new religious ideas. The violence won't end though for another 100 years. But the Peace of Augsburg, princes, or I should say kings, are given the prerogative to either stay with the church or to break away from the church. Many kings in what it would become modern Germany much later. Germany doesn't exist as a country. It's a patchwork of all these independent city-states and small kingdoms. Many of the kings in that region are going to choose Protestantism and break away from the church, often because then they can essentially nationalize all of the church wealth. That's what Henry VIII did in England. A lot of these kings in the German states, the Germanic states, are going to do the same. Same in Scandinavia, up in Northern Europe. They're going to seize all that church property for themselves or for the state. Before the Protestant Reformation, there were two forms of laws. There were the secular laws of the state, of the kingdom, and then there were ecclesiastical laws or church laws. Well, those ecclesiastical laws or church laws are going to be less and less important as these Protestant nations break away from the church and build their own new societies. Lutherans emphasize salvation by faith over works. What's most important is one's faith, all right? It's not a theological class, so we're not going to study too much of the theology, but you have to know a little bit about it. The next thing, set of ideas on that spectrum of religious beliefs in your notes there would be Calvinism, the followers of John Calvin. These guys are getting pretty radical because they reject a lot of the Catholic Church's beliefs. Some of them even become very skeptical about baptism itself, and baptism should only be administered to adults. Modern Baptists today have their roots in kind of Calvinist traditions. For example, John Calvin has a lot of influence in the southern United States and what would become later baptism. The Baptist tradition. Methodists as well would fall under Calvinists. Calvinists also are obsessed with sin, obsessed with wrongdoing. So in the place where the followers of John Calvin come to power, in places like Geneva in Switzerland, they put in place all of these laws to try and abolish sin, to kind of usher in as much as possible a godly world here on planet Earth. So they pass laws against playing of cards, swearing, drunkenness. Adultery is pretty harshly punished. So this is what separated them. And then also related to the Calvinists on that far end of the spectrum of beliefs are Puritans. These are the extreme folks who want to purify life here on earth. They're very similar to those followers of Calvin. In fact, they are followers of Calvin. You can read about what are known as the Anabaptists. These folks are those who were so radical that they didn't really believe that all that was important was faith. They believed that baptism wasn't that important, and if you were to be baptized, you certainly would have to be an adult. the followers of the Anabaptists and these extreme Puritans and Protestants on that far end of the spectrum of beliefs were those of Zwingli. Many of them would live in what is today the Netherlands or Holland, there in Northern Europe. So that's what I've gone over with you today. Are some of the causes of the Protestant Reformation. You can see the causes of the Protestant Reformation in the fall of Constantinople. You can see it in the invention of the printing press. Also be aware that there were other protest movements against the Catholic Church prior to this. John Wycliffe in England was one such leader. Then I went all over the spectrum of beliefs that came out of the Protestant Reformation. And I think that's enough information to get us started this week with the Reformation. We'll continue our discussion online. Thanks for listening. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll see you on the discussion boards.
Okay.